All right, we're going to look at how to unify this image a little bit more and also create a little bit more depth and texture to this. So, of course, I could have actually set up an entire still life and just photographed it and then added elements as separate foreground elements. That would have been fine, and hopefully if you have really good sketches, you can plan ahead like that. But I like things that look a little bit more surreal, that have a little bit more spookiness and uncanniness to them. That's just me. So anyway, I've added this texture of just, planks from our back porch. And what I'm going to do is first do some color adjustments on it. So I've dragged this above that coat layer, and I'm going to go ahead and do hue and saturation and just pull that down a little bit so it doesn't have quite so much of a green cast to it. All right, and next I'm going to go ahead and, oops, let me make sure I make that a clipping mask. Next I'm going to go ahead and set that to be a blending mode. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to multiply. You can go through and sort of try different versions and see what looks good. But I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more subtle. Now the next thing I want to do is play around with blurring this, but I don't want to blur the whole thing uniformly. I want to blur it a little bit more strategically. So I'm going to shy this for a second and go back to my coat layer. Now my coat is still a smart object. So if I go to filter and go down to blur, Gaussian blur, what I can do is decide like, okay, how blurry do I want, say, the backgrounds to be? About that much. Now what I can do is if I go down to that filter, you can see that Smart Filters has this big white square there. Hey, that looks a lot like a mask. In fact, it is. So this is why smart objects are really great. So I have that smart filter there for the Gaussian blur, and I have my gradient set up. I changed it to be black and white. And I also set it to basically do a kind of a cylinder sort of shading. So I'm going to just click and drag this and try to decide, which way do I want this to go. I'm going to go ahead and toggle that color so it goes in the other way so that I have something a little bit like this. And I can decide if I want it to be really blurry at the front, the top of the bottom. I can sort of play around with that a little bit. All right, so I have it a little bit blurry in the front, pretty blurry in the back, and then it's getting a little bit sharper. If I don't like how that blur looks, one of the things I can do if I option click on it is I can actually play around with the value of it. So if I go to brightness and contrast, for example, and I check use legacy, I can make the whole thing quite a bit darker, and I can even pull down the contrast to make this a little bit more subtle. I'm actually going to pull up the contrast and do something like that. Now I can option click on that, and now I can see I have more of that coat visible. The other thing I can do is I can select that smart filter, and I can go to, oops, I just undid it. Let me go back to that filter. And I can go to adjustments and brightness and contrast. And I can look at how that filter is functioning in here without changing, without having to look at the filter itself. So I can sort of play around with like what happens if I make it more contrasty, less contrasty, what happens if I make it brighter or darker. So I want to just play around with that until I get something that's a little bit more subtle, but not too subtle. There we go, something like that. All right, so that's about the blurriness that I want the coat to have at the top and the bottom, and the rest of it looks pretty good. Now I can go back to that wood, and I'm basically going to do the same sort of thing with it. So I'm going to go ahead and go to filter and do Gaussian blur. And again, because it's a smart object, if you don't see that mask at first, you can twirl down and then you can see that smart filter. So make sure you click on the filter mask so that you can actually affect it. And right now I can't really see anything. So I'm going to go ahead and invert that. So with that mask selected, I'm going to do Command I. And now I can see sort of how that mask works. Now here's the other thing you can do with masks like that. I can use a gradient, but if I just know that I want it to be blurrier in some spots more than other spots, I can just grab a brush and make it really big. Make sure the opacity is pulled down. Make sure the opacity, is pulled down. And make sure that it's really soft. And I can just start kind of drawing over this, and it's gradually blurring out different parts of it. So I just want this topmost corner to sort of be a little bit more blurry. There we go. And that bottom part, I want it to be a little blurry too. And maybe not quite that much, so if I hit X, I can toggle my black and my white. And I'll come and bring that back in a little bit more. There we go. And if I don't really like how that looks, I can always do a blur onto that filter itself, but I think that works out pretty okay. So now I've just sort of made that background coat look a little bit less sort of flat. It has a little bit more texture and depth to it. It's also a little darker. Now, finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new adjustment layer, but it's going to affect everything below it. So I'm going to go to my levels, and I'm not going to make it a clipping mask. It's going to affect everything below it. And what I can do is sort of decide, like, all right, how dark do I want this to be? So I want to darken up the whole image quite a bit, and I want to increase the contrast a little bit. There we go. So that's really, really dark. But now what I'm going to do is do Command I to invert that mask. And then same thing, I'm going to grab my B from my brush, make it really big, make sure the opacity is pulled down pretty low. And then I'm just going to draw back on that to sort of darken out those corners a little bit. So I'm kind of basically giving it vignetting a little bit. So this is pretty subtle, but it's doing some work that I needed to do. All right, there we go. That looks pretty good. All right. So now one thing to think about when I make my sort of flattened version of this, all of these layers are going to get squished together in one layer. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. If I'm worried about getting really confused with all these layers, what I can do is I can select all of them and make them a group. So I'll call this background. And now I know that this is just one entire group altogether. I don't have to think about it anymore, and I'm ready to move on to the next thing. All right, we're getting there. Now the next thing I need to do is try to unify this image a little bit more. This is going to be especially tricky with things like that bowl and the candle that are clearly sort of sitting on top of everything else. So one way I can do this is by using textures. Now I have this texture of just basically cement. It's okay, it's maybe a little bit too high contrast, but I'm going to try to work with it right now anyway. Now if I set this to say multiply or something like that, you can see that it actually does a pretty good job unifying all the forms behind it, but it's a little bit too dark. And the other thing is I want to be able to control it a little bit more in terms of the individual objects that are here. So I already have it placed above the adjustment layers for that deer skull. I have it below the highlights for the deer because I want to keep that as a separate form. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to control click on this and go down to create clipping mask. And that way it's going to be a clipping mask just above whatever is beneath it, which in this case is just the deer skull. So it's set to multiply right now, and that looks pretty good, but it's a little too dark. So what I'm going to do is go to brightness and contrast, and I'm going to make this a clipping mask on my clipping mask basically. And I'm going to just go ahead and pull up that brightness and modify the contrast a little bit to kind of get something that's a little bit lighter, but not too light. So I'm going to play around with this a little bit. There we go. That's about what I want. So I'm looking at my lightest areas. Now you can see that this has a clipping mask on it. So what I can do is I can go into this, and let's say I want the bottom part of this where the skull is touching the ground to be a little bit darker. What I can do is go to that mask, and I have my brush, it's set to black. The opacity is already pulled down. So I can just go in and make some subtle brush marks here to kind of give it a little bit more shadow where it's connecting with the ground. And this is going to automatically help it feel like a little bit more anchored to this space. So I don't want to do it so much that it sort of undoes that, but this was my original form, and now this is it with that texture on it and also that adjustment layer. So I can kind of see, basically what it still is, but now I'm going to go ahead and do this process for the other objects. Now over here you can see that I ended up doing some burning and dodging with this candle, and also doing some saturation on the wax to give it a little bit of a brighter glow back because of that candle. And I want to do the same thing over here, but because of the way that I'm using a smart group, basically, remember this is a nested folder, there's a couple other ways I can approach this without having to go back into that. So right now I have a brightness and contrast on that to try to shape this candle a little bit more. So I want it to look like it's getting more light from this candle and from itself than from behind it. So, but I do want to have a little bit more saturation at the top of that candle. So one way I can do this is I can go ahead and add a hue saturation, and make this a clipping mask. And I can just go ahead and boost up the saturation. What I want to do is I want to make sure that that candle has kind of the redness that I'm shooting for. Now obviously this whole thing is too red right now, but what I can do is I can take the mask for that hue and saturation and invert it. So Command I to invert it. Now it basically looks like nothing was happening to it, right? If I turn this on or off, it's the same thing. But if I grab my brush, I hit X to toggle black and white, what I can do is come back in and add a little bit of red back into that top part of the candle. So I'm going to pull my opacity down just a little bit and just make a couple small passes at this to kind of give it that red punch back. And if I do a little bit too much, that's okay. It's not a big deal. I can come back, toggle my black and my white, and just reduce that a little bit. So there we go. So it's a subtle gesture, but details like that will end up making a big difference in the long run. Okay, so this is basically my finished scene. I'm actually going to do one more little robotics creature that's going to walk through the scene. But basically this is it. This is complete. So what I would want to do after I make sure I save is I want to save a version where these different groupings are merged. So remember, the rule of thumb is if you want something to be able to move, like say the highlights, the flickering highlights on this bowl right here, then you want to make sure that it's on a separate layer. If you're pretty confident that nothing in a particular group is going to move, like this bowl of acorns with the antlers, then good, go ahead and merge it. So what I'm going to do first though, before I merge it, is I'm going to triple check that this is saved. And then I'm going to do a save as, and I'll save it to my computer. Now I've already created my folder. So if we were going to look this under columns view, then you should be able to see on my desktop, I have, where is this guy? There we go. There's my project folder. I've made a graphics folder, and inside that is this current PSD. So I want to rename this one merged, just so that I know what's what. And then now that I know that I have a new copy of this saved, I can go through and merge these groups. So I can control click on it and say merge group. And again, you want to just turn on and off particular layers just to double check that you do in fact want to merge it. So merge group. Now, if I had textures that were overlaying the entire scene, let's say, that weren't being used as clipping masks, I'd want to make sure that those stay as their own layers. So in these cases, everything that's going to be its own layer, I already went ahead and set those up, set them with blending modes. So the skull, okay, I'm going to go ahead and merge that group. And then there's this candle. And you can see in some of these I've added shadows so that it looks a little bit more like it's sitting kind of on the ground. So I'm just going to go ahead and merge that group. I could animate those shadows. So here, this is a good example of where when you merge a group, sometimes you lose how that original grouping looked. So here I have basically a blending mode set to multiply, which is that candle shadow. So I'm actually going to unpack that. I'll call this candle to shadow. And I'm going to leave this set to multiply 64 since it kind of needs to sit on top of it and affects both the background and the candle. So now this is just that candle. I'll go ahead and merge that group. And so now that candle shadow is going to be fine. So it's not actually going to get animated, but if you're using blending modes and it's affecting multiple layers, then sometimes you do have to unpack them. Then there's this bowl, and I think the bowl is going to have the same situation where it's got a drop shadow onto it. So I'm going to pull this one out and call it bowl shadow. Again, this is set to multiply, and it's subtle, but it's affecting both the background and the bowl. So I'll go ahead and merge this group. Oops. There we go. There's the skull shadow already on its own layer, and I don't need that bowl mask grouping anymore. Remember, that was there to make sure that I didn't do any destructive changes. And then finally, that background is going to be its own layer. So I'll go ahead and merge that group. All right, so now this guy is basically ready to be imported into After Effects and animated.